All right, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back once again for another appearance, Fern Halper, the Vice President and Senior Research Director for Advanced Analytics, here with us at TDWI. Fern is a very frequent guest on this podcast. I'm very happy to have her back again to discuss some upcoming research reports that we'll be releasing, specifically a best practices report on creating an AI-ready organization. Before we jump into everything, how are you doing, Fern? Where do we find you today?
I'm good. I'm in my home office and everything's good.
Good.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, I know that you've been working pretty hard on this best practices report. It's getting very close to being published, which is why we're talking about it today. And it's actually, I think it might be building on something that you released, that we released at the back end of last year, which is that state of AI readiness report. And again, it leads nicely into this creating an AI ready organization. Can you talk a little bit about those two reports that we released and how they kind of coincide here and why it's important?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Andrew. So we published the state of AI readiness, I think it was in the later part of last year. And we did that research because with generative AI, many organizations, even those that haven't necessarily done anything with any kind of AI, they're feeling pressure to do something. So and of course, there are projects that you can do without involving data and analytics professionals with generative AI. You can, do things like generate marketing copy or email or summarize documents. So the point was that there was this other class of problems that organizations wanted to use generative AI for that involved company data. So, that's where we come in, right? Both structured and unstructured data. So, for instance, they wanted to build applications like chatbots that might use customer information or segment and analyze customer behavior and then generate emails for that. So, there were use cases that were going to require um, organizations to actually have a solid data foundation and skills and governance. And so that's what this AI readiness assessment was about. So we saw overall that organizations were working to put data foundations in place for AI and generative AI. And that was all good news, that we're seeing progress in that area, although there were still some issues with skills and governance and other factors, some organizational factors. So part of this new BPR was looking at some of the organizational factors for AI. We look at other things also because we know that obviously organizational factors can make or break an AI or really any analytics or data effort. So that was the idea, are they ready? They're somewhat ready, and then, well, let's look at the best practices that would go into making them more ready.
Oh, that obviously tracks beautifully, and I'm curious. I know the report has yet to be published. It should be out very soon. But what were some of the findings that you're able to share with us at this point?
Yeah, I can give you, well, here, I'll tease it. I'll give one preliminary insight.
Okay, great.
And we're going to have a webinar on this best practices report, I think on March 31st, and I'll share a lot more of it then. But one thing I thought that was very interesting was that those organizations who actually had a CDO, a chief data officer, who was part of the C-suite, actually had a much better likelihood of obtaining value from their AI efforts than those who don't. And that was actually statistically significant. So we started to see this in some of the research we did a few years ago as CDOs were entering the scene. And so I was hoping that we'd, see this more in this report. And we did. And, you may ask, why would this be the case? I think because CDOs and chief analytics officers are typically tasked, their job is to leverage data as a core business asset in order to ensure that analytics and AI efforts, they tie to measurable business outcomes like revenue growth or cost savings, customer satisfaction. They need to do that to show that they're being successful. And so if they're in the C-suite, that actually enables a stronger emphasis on integrating data-driven strategies across the organization. And it makes sure that there's accountability for ROI. It makes sure that you're aligning the initiatives with broader business goals because you have access to those broader business goals. And so organizations that prioritize and measure value, they often elevate these roles to the C-suite because, then there's strategic oversight and alignment. So I thought that that was interesting, and sort of along with that, those that have the CDO or CAO in place for AI, they seem to be more satisfied with their leadership structure than those who may just have a VP or director of IT leading the effort. So we'll see what happens in the next few years about that, but that's what it's looking like so far, and it makes sense, if you think about it, because we've seen in the past that having an executive um, on board and with it and evangelizing it is going to help. So now if there's the CDO who's part of the C-suite, it sort of makes sense that
Hmm.
a person will evangelize it to the CEO. The CEO, can set the vision and the tone. It all sort of flows together.
Well, then I guess my next question is, what about organizing to execute? Are there different models that work better specifically for that?
Yeah. So we did. I guess the short answer is not. We don't know yet, but we did ask the respondents about how they were organized to execute for analytics and AI. And when people talk about organizational models now, they typically are talking about three different models. There's the centralized model where all the data functions, the ownership, and the activities, all of that is in a central office, and that office is responsible for the data strategy, the data platform, governance, and that's the centralized model. And about a third of the respondents were in that centralized model. And then there's a decentralized or distributed model where the data activities are distributed into different business units. So the business unit owns its data as well as what it wants to do with the data. So it's distributed that way. And so meaning that the data and analytics functions sit in the business units. And another, about a third, also cited that. And then there's this new model that people have been talking about for the past few years called a hub and spoke or hybrid model. That's where there may be a data office and the CDO or CAO may be in charge of that data office. It could be the hub. And that office provides the strategies and policies and standards. It supports architecture, and it provides recommendations on the environment to support analytics and AI. And that data office is also responsible, importantly, for coordinating governance activities. And so the business units may own their own data, but they work closely with the data office to ensure that the data is high quality and it's available and all of that. And so guess what? Another third are using that model. So, a couple of years ago, we asked the same question, and more respondents were using the distributed model than we're using a hub and spoke model. So it may be that some of the distributed stuff is moving away from a decentralized to a hub and spoke models. It's unclear yet, but what we saw in this survey was that larger companies, they tended to have all three kinds of models. Smaller companies tended to lean toward centralized models, which made sense, right? Because they would have simpler operations. And mid-sized companies showed a preference for the distributed model. So the jury's still out on that. A lot of people are talking about a hub and spoke model. It makes sense intuitively, that it makes sense that you want to have a central office that is coordinating, governance and, what types of tools and technologies should be used by the enterprise and, really trying to make it all work. But sometimes that's easier said than done, obviously. So, we'll see what happens. That's where we are now.
Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about the different types of organizational models on this podcast as well. I know that the results specific to this best practices are a little bit maybe too close to call, but trending wise, you've been tracking this for years. Are you seeing, in your particular opinion, a model that companies should look to use first?
I think that the hub and spoke model makes sense, if for nothing else than for governance, for data governance. And now as we move into analytics and AI governance, it makes sense to me.
Hmm.
That's, but if you not that these are statistically different, but the centralized model still has, I said a third, and a third, but of course it was like the centralized model was 38%, and
Hmm.
the hub and spoke model was like 34%. It wasn't,
Yeah, yeah.
significantly different, but so I like the idea of a hub and spoke model
Hmm.
myself.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked a little bit about like the C-suite, and then we're talking about organizing to execute. I think the next question that makes sense is the rest of the folks in the organization, the ones that may need to be, handling a lot of this on the day-to-day side. So I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about culture and where this fits in. How important is culture for AI, and what are organizations doing about it?
Yeah, I think it's really important. We've certainly known for a long time, as I said a few minutes ago, that executives have that we always saw that executives, where they're there and they help to evangelize and people see that they're using analytics, that they set the vision and the tone, and that's always been a best practice for organizations if they can get their executive to set the vision, etc., etc. But like as you said, it obviously goes deeper than that because you have to have people on board if you're going to affect any change, and so that means understanding what motivates them to change. So I think it probably is going to mean implementing change management initiatives, especially if people think that their job is under fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to mean communication, it's going to mean creativity. So if we look at, the change management and the communication and how to creatively make that happen, and these are just three factors, there's more than that, but um, we do see organizations making use of change management frameworks that are out there. And so there's a number of them out there. And some of them were created in the 1990s and they're still used today in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm.
There's this ADKAR model that we hear in our summits, people talk about using ADKAR. So ADKAR is ADKAR, and it basically stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So it focuses on individual sort of change management, and it tries to help ensure that employees understand and embrace transformation. And this was created by a guy named Jeff Hyatt in the 1990s. So that's a popular one. There's another one that's called like the Bridges transition model. This is interesting. It was also created in the 90s, and it focuses on sort of the emotional side of change because if people are concerned, how do you get them sort of buying into this? And it has three stages: ending, neutral zone, and new beginning. So this guy Bridges was I think it was him and his wife, but they were prominent organizational consultants in the 90s, and they thought about recognizing and managing endings before moving on to new beginnings.
Mm.
So some of this stuff, it's psychological,
Yeah,
and that's what it is.
right.
So organizations are trying to implement some of that. And then along with that, they also realize that communication, you can't just expect that people are going to buy into AI or use it if they don't understand what it is. Obviously, data literacy is going to play into this as well, but it's important for the organization, the people in the organization, to see that those who talk the talk are walking the walk, like I was talking about before. So they're using data to make decisions. Other types of creative, like communication approaches, we've seen organizations doing things like when they launch a new program, it's like a marketing campaign. They have a marketing campaign along with it. So I was talking to one organization that actually put together a whole video, with messaging and everything about what they were going to be doing with AI. And so they had that playing across the organization, and they were trying to show people, hey, this can really help you, and it's not replacing your job, it's just helping you in your job, so that people can get excited about it. That's approach that some companies are taking. so really like rolling it out and
Mm.
having a whole rollout plan and training plan and getting people excited plan. And then once it's rolled out to one part of the organization, they're going to publicize the results there, the stuff that you would think about
Mm.
doing. We've seen the formation of innovation teams also. That's a lot of organizations are trying that out. And so the idea is that they they try out new ideas, they really collaborate with the business to see what's going to work from the business perspective. So they bring the stakeholders in for that, and they decide based on different criteria and working with the stakeholders what types of AI projects to roll out first. And they have a whole methodology usually to see how this would work. Um, we've obviously, like I was talking about before, seen companies that are putting AI and data and analytics literacy programs in place, because that's going to be really
Mm.
important also. So there's no one approach that necessarily works, although there are important principles that need to be implemented. Um, an incubator program might be effective in one organization, but it may not be effective in another organization that doesn't have, data practices in place. So, I think that, it does start with the leadership at the top. They provide the vision and the alignment and the momentum and the resources, that's needed to make AI actually successful in the organization. And then communication is necessary to address concerns and to get employees on board, and being creative about how you do all of this, is obviously important too. So there's lots of ways that organizations are going about it, but those are some that sort of pop to the top.
I want to reinforce here for folks, this is mostly the conversation today has been about the best practices report, creating an AI ready organization. It is unreleased at the moment. It will be out very shortly within the next couple of weeks. And as Fern mentioned earlier, we will be doing a webinar at TDWI for this as well. You can see both Fern, well, you'll see Fern, you'll hear me on that webinar if you are interested in tuning in for more information. Fern, anything else before I let you go here that you wanted to maybe a key takeaway? Anything else you'd like to mention
No,
before?
I mean, I think it's a good read. I encourage people to look at it. Some interesting correlations with, in the data, that I think people will be interested in.
And I'm curious also, kind of building off of the notion of people that might, read this best practices report. They may be interested after reading it and going back and taking the AI readiness assessment to kind of see where they fit and what best practices they can. Is that still something that they can do?
Oh
Is
yeah,
the AI readiness assessment still available?
yeah, absolutely. So it's on our website. It's under Think, and then if you go under Think, you'll see assessments, and then just click on that button, and you'll see all the assessments we have there. And the AI readiness one is one of them. So yeah, definitely a good point. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah,
Awesome. Well, Fern, it's always a pleasure talking with you. I'm excited for the release of this best practices report. I'll see you on the webinar as well, and around around the office, quote unquote, the virtual office that we have here at TDWI. But thank you again for your time today. It's always a pleasure talking with you. Have a good rest of your day.
you too. Thanks, Andrew.
To subscribe to the Speaking of Data podcast, or to learn more about TDWI's research and training on all things data management and analytics, visit tdwi.org or click the link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in.